It's 2 a.m., January 1st, year 2000. Power's out. It's pitch black. You need light. If you planned ahead, you'll have one of these. Just wind it up. You'll have light and communication.
Watch this. I've got a plan. I can beat this thing. X. Why?
Nothing traveled in my area.
It's thinking.
People are becoming electronic publishers. They're putting up the things that mean something to them and they want to share it with the rest of the world. And what Mosaic does is it provides a window into this incredible cyberspace, this information.
Join me and my special guest.
It's the end of the millennium.
We could all be living in the dark ages.
Now the time has finally run out. What if they're right?
Future sound. Deep Blue. A computer. Kasparov won the first game in a breeze. But the next day, he got the shock of his life.
Tell the operator to rush an ultimate Y2K survival kit to your home. Call now.
Welcome back to Intruder, Kojima's Metal Gear and the Medium. In this entry, Part 4, we'll be deviating from prior virtual essays in the series somewhat. Instead of focusing on just the making of, or the story, we'll be approaching MGS2 from an unusual angle. We'll try to overview the game both in terms of story, but more crucially for our purposes, also at the same time, in terms of what Sons of Liberty meant and means still to this medium. Let's begin. It's the new millennium, the turn of the century. Sony has a new console, and the world is stunned by a trailer for one of its upcoming games. The title, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty.
At E3, the biggest video game trade show of the year, one game dominated conversation. Every hour, huge crowds gathered to watch the preview of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty.
It's a new century. One where the logic of nuclear deterrence is growing obsolete. And new threats are emerging, like small-scale wars, dual-use technology and terrorism. The single biggest buzzword on everyone's lips, from the military to civilians: information. As in information superhighway, but also information warfare. One information machine that embodies all this about the Y2K age and more? The aforementioned Sony PlayStation 2. Experts at this time fear what the dual-use PS2 could do in the hands of nuclear dictators like Saddam Hussein. But its true power won't be in any military applications or simulations. It'll be in how incredibly and single-handedly the console will catalyze the next phase of the digital revolution. Doing so armed with a relatively new format called the Digital Versatile Disc, DVD. The DVD is the result of a full-blown format war in the mid-90s, similar to the one that had played out between Betamax and VHS. Once accepted by all the major tech and media companies as the new standard, the DVD would still take some time to take over. The PS2 would prove to be its tipping point. As development on MGS2 first began in the late 1990s, games were in a unique place. Their cultural value has never been higher, yet their longevity has never seemed more transient. At the recent International Solid-State Circuits Conference, Sony Computer Entertainment and Toshiba described a multimedia processor that will be the heart of the next-generation PlayStation, which, lacking an official name, we refer to as PlayStation 2000, or PSX2. Called the Emotion Engine, or EE, the new chip upsets the traditional notion of a game processor. With the EE pumping out 75 million polygons per second and the GS, or graphics synthesizer, drawing polygons at 2.4 billion pixels per second, the PlayStation 2000 will bring Toy Story-like realism to home games, or so says SCE. To maintain its King of the Mountain status, SCE had to do something spectacular, and it has. The PSX2 will deliver more than 10 times the polygon throughput of Dreamcast, leaving it and other competitors in the virtual dust. With DVD-ROM, Dolby Digital and digital theater system sound, a modem, USB, and more, the PSX2 system could be more than just a game console. Keith Diefendorf, Microprocessor Report, 1999. As this quote suggests, the PS2 was powerful indeed, but the console would soon become notorious, as it was very difficult to program for. MSNBC wrote in 2000, quote, "It's no secret that the PS2 is difficult to program. Designers at Namco, Konami, and Squaresoft all mentioned difficulties. One programmer who wished to remain anonymous pinned his dislike of PS2 on the following, quote, Sony had provided an extensive library with PlayStation. The library would do a lot of the work, but with PS2, there is no library. We need to create our own, which poses its own set of problems in that there are so many choices to achieve the same effects." End quote. The article goes on. Capcom's Keiji Inafune takes complaints about the PS2 library even further. Quote, "There really isn't a library, so we have to make one up as we go along. Starting a new project means that we start with developing the library first." End quote. Simply put, the way the console moved around data and generated graphics utilized the entire machine in a very specialized way, requiring a mastery of not only all its parts individually by a developer, but also mastery of how those different parts worked together. Due to this shared workflow of the PS2, which even featured dual-use microchips doing two different tasks at separate times, the PS2 design environment was unique, not like other consoles, not like PC.
So when we talk about the PlayStation 2, developers really had to think differently in order to get the best out of the machine. Gone were the days of a large block of VRAM and large caches. The PlayStation 2 had a very small cache size and pretty small VRAM, so developers really had to start thinking about different ways to optimize and tune their games in order to take advantage of all the custom PlayStation 2 chips.
Because of problems that had occurred late in MGS1's development, not to mention similar size and compression issues during work on more or less every single Kojima game, for Metal Gear Solid 2, KCE Japan prioritized data management. To quote the document of MGS2, one of our goals was efficient data management, thanks to dealing with large data volumes for MGS1, end quote. As I said, the PS2 dev boards initially lacked the same kinds of Sony-made libraries that had been offered by the PS1. These had made programming for that console easier by saving devs the trouble of having to make every program tool themselves in-house and from scratch. MGS2 would, far more than its predecessor, require KCE Japan making a host of specialized dev tools, including a proprietary program scripting engine, and a system for file sharing, a data network server that the team could access from anywhere at any time. The central manifesto behind the game, Kojima's grand design document, was made available for the rest of the team throughout the process, even as it was being updated or altered in real time, right alongside the team's virtual bulletin board. All of this helped decentralize the dev team's own workflow, exactly, perhaps like the workflow of the PS2. To quote again the document of MGS2, quote, "Since MGS2 was a very large project, the ease of use of these tools had a direct impact on the efficiency of tasks. These tools were then modified repeatedly while being used to meet the needs of those who used them," end quote. The PS2 marks a major turning point for the entire medium. For Kojima's entire career, games have remained, for most people, toys, a mere exotic hobby. Now, following the exponential technological growth of the 1990s, now with the PS2, games are suddenly legitimized. And at this point at the turn of the century, it's no exaggeration to say that Japan is the single dominant cultural force in the medium. But with the Atari crash now nothing but a fading memory, the West is yet again poised to fully re-enter the games industry. Kojima and KCE Japan, following the success of MGS1, start to become arbiters and avatars for Japanese gaming. With his profile rising, Kojima, with Sons of Liberty, has a chance to finally put his name on the map as a fixture of the Japanese scene, a name that even Westerners will recognize. But to do so, KCE Japan will have to, more than ever, create Metal Gear games with both audiences, East and West, in mind. MGS2 will have to be a lot of things to a lot of people. Consequently, certain elements won't do as well worldwide as others. Yet MGS2 will nonetheless succeed in its seemingly impossible goal of being a thoroughly Japanese game for a global audience. And this goal was no less shared by the PS2, as evinced by Teiyu Goto's Earth and Space themed console design. MGS2 had a well-documented marketing campaign that broke major ground all in of itself.
I stare
at the stars and the sky up above.
Last time, I suggested that Kojima's main contribution in general has been to widen the gaming magic circle, drawing into the game elements that traditionally are kept out. For MGS2, the circle widened to encompass everything about the title, even down to the marketing. Kojima flashed the world with his cryptic, esoteric adverts. Displaying, for example, this god from Hindu mythology, and a bunch of even more cryptic quotes and declarations, one of which being a declaration not so much of liberty as complete submergence. Kojima prepared the world for MGS2 with oceanic imagery from the very start, saying he would not be seen again until his game was complete. In 2001, the year of the snake. With the turn of the century came major advances, from AI to the World Wide Web, tethered at the time as it was to Wall Street. This resulted in what today we now know as the dot-com bubble.
After what they are already calling Black Friday, they are counting up the damage on Wall Street tonight.
In the spring of 2000,
was the worst single-day point loss ever for both exchanges.
But at the same time as this bubble, Hollywood movies were bubbling up themselves, becoming more successful than ever, thanks no doubt in part to their post-Cold War era's new global reach. Even domestically, box office revenue from 1990 to 2000 virtually doubled, from $4 billion to $8 billion. Huge blockbusters like The Matrix, but also Titanic, Independence Day, and Saving Private Ryan all rocked the world one after the other. America's high from supposedly winning the Cold War was only just beginning to fade. The 20th century had become known as the American century. MGS2 was made at a time when it seemed the 21st century would follow it, would be even more dominated by the US and its cultural arsenal, not to mention its newly super high-techified military-industrial entertainment complex.
I was part of the Army's Force 21 trials.
Force 21? That's about tactical IT deployment, right?
There's pain sensation in VR and even a sense of reality and urgency. The only difference is it isn't actually happening.
That's the way they want you to think, to remove you from the fear that goes with battle situations. War is a video game. What better way to raise the ultimate soldier?
George Washington took office as the first president of the United States of America 200 years ago today. And it happened right here. We were going to declare another independence, the dawn of a new nation, here.
Metal Gear 2 and MGS1 had, to varying extents, commented on or portrayed the times that they were made in. But MGS2 was uniquely poised.
We were shown Hollywood action films every day. The kind with macho guys and big guns. They call it image training.
MGS2's ambiguous love-hate relationship with Hollywood is really at the crux of the game. This was a complex conceptual relationship that maybe was only expressible as a video game, and in this way also, MGS2 was something new.
で、ライデンは、キングコングです。手錠をはめられて、ローズという女の子を、その道具として使われて、都会に来たっていうか、だから2人は非常に対照的なキャラクターにしてあります。
And that was our first date.
We watched King Kong in your apartment a bunch of times that night. Didn't sleep till morning. If it weren't for that coincidence, we wouldn't be together.
I know. I'm sorry, Jack. I'm taking up your time again.
What?
Take care.
The shift all went back to Sons of Liberty's status as the ultimate so-called Hollywood game. A new kind of interactive or playable movie. MGS2 came at the perfect time and place. As the technology for gaming evolved, creators rightly recognized, its both form and content had to grow too. The way Sons of Liberty was put together, both in terms of story and gameplay, was itself thereby rather revolutionary. During this period, a growing influence was evident from a sister Konami series, Silent Hill. First devised beginning in 1996, Silent Hill and MGS1 had shared a lot, from in-house dev tools to Western market orientation. As MGS2 was being made, so too was Team Silent working on their true opus, released also in 2001, Silent Hill 2. As such, both titles and what they'd represent for the medium should be considered jointly. And we can also add a third sibling here, also released that same year, Zone of the Enders. Though only produced by Kojima and not directed, there's no question Zone was about KCE Japan getting its feet wet developing for this new console. Zone of the Enders was a fast-paced robot action title that used the spaceship vibes of the PS2 to great effect. Its anime art style may be more visually loud, but there's no question that it bears great resemblance to Metal Gear Solid 2. Zone of the Enders and MGS2 both brought with them a sense that the future had finally arrived, not only as works of science fiction, but as cutting-edge video games. Silent Hill 2, meanwhile, took MGS1's route and utilized grainy, visually less striking or sanitized-looking visuals. But beneath the fog and shadow, Silent Hill 2 was a masterpiece of handmade facial animations, sound design, and above all else, psychological expressionism. It was with this that all three games aligned. All three were explorations in their own ways of human psychology. In Zone of the Enders, we open as protagonist Leo Stenbuck witnesses the death of his friends and the start of a war that quickly consumes his entire space colony. He's then forced to pilot a mysterious giant robot, Jehudi, and join in this war, all while reasoning with the machine's AI system, Ada. It's both in terms of psychological depth and visuals that Zone of the Enders and MGS2 coincide. The blue-greenish glow inside Jehudi, and its complex, strangely elegant design outside as well. It resembles MGS2's same look and feel, especially its more sci-fi elements, such as inside Arsenal gear, or the design, also by Yoji Shinkawa just as Jehudi, of Metal Gear Ray. Silent Hill 2, meanwhile, put you in the mind of one James Sunderland, a grief-stricken narcissist on a collision course with his own past. Just like MGS2, Silent Hill 2 was largely built around depictions of mundane romantic relationships as a means of commenting on the everyday morality, the ceaseless dreamy boredom of the pre-9/11 post-Cold War fugue state age. But where MGS2 and Silent Hill 2 also coincided had to be in terms of surrealism, which goes hand in hand with these stories about memory, nightmares, and perception. Both works served as satires of the modern American dream to some extent, of the white picket fence and loving wife. Both have an Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole-like quality to them, especially as they near the end. Both games begin with big shells, pseudo-worlds in a meta fourth wall breaking kind of way, which are only set up for us to experience in real time their disintegration. Sons of Liberty, however, was much more varied in its game scenarios than either of its siblings. This had to do with how rapidly and continuously its development was undergoing change. MGS2, hard as it is to believe, was assembled as a composite out of many different smaller design ideas. This worked because, well, of how well this modular structure fit alongside prior Kojima games. From Snatcher to Policenauts and all three prior Metal Gears, Kojima's adventure game roots, perhaps, have meant that players over the years have had to learn how to play his games on the job. New, unique scenarios would appear in his games which you'd never seen before, and now suddenly had to master to move forward. In Policenauts, this was stuff like bomb disposal. In MGS1, this was sniping, using the Nikita, or fighting any of the bosses. Scenarios were always piecemeal and abruptly changing. That's just how Kojima's games were made. So it also was with MGS2. But even for a Kojima production, things were a little fly-by-night during the development of this game. Sons of Liberty began first as a scenario where Snake would have to complete a mission involving nuclear weapons inspectors in Iraq, taking place inside an aircraft carrier that needed to be completed within a set time. Too short, this was first replaced and then combined with a longer scenario that we would later know as the Plant Chapter. And to fill this all out, members of the dev team were instructed to carry around notebooks and jot down design ideas. It was out of this process scenarios like MGS2's bomb disposal, hostage rescue, and VIP escort sequences were born. But to flesh out some of these new features, and as part of the overall conceit of the game as the Hollywood game, the team spent considerable time and energy just on research. Multiple trips spent photographing reference materials took place in places like Manhattan to waste treatment plants and battleships across Japan. And the prior title's military advisor, Motosada Mori, was brought closer into the fold for Sons of Liberty. The former SWAT instructor taught KCE Japan the basics that they would use to create MGS2's AI and animations, all to ensure a level of authenticity that few rival titles could compete with. However, what would truly make MGS2 so important, perhaps, was how completely the game as a game captured the turn-of-the-century zeitgeist. Created in the midst of the aforementioned Y2K panic, Sons of Liberty was philosophical, political, dreamlike, and all-around subversive in ways that few had with video games ever seen before. People unhappy with MGS2's lack of Snake and emphasis on Raiden and Raiden's plot would soon rejoice at the expansion pack, Substance, which added in scores of new gameplay, in the form of alternate and virtual realities, from a huge number of new VR missions to a new series of missions, Snake Tales. Technology is moving so fast that games don't stay the same for very long. And as a result, game franchises remain in a near constant flux, near constant states of reinvention. With MGS2's opening chapter, Tanker, this burgeoning norm got subtly challenged. Normally, new entries in a long-running series would not follow the previous entry's story, but rather merely adopt the same general gameplay systems or mechanics. MGS2 was devised as a solution to this problem, which of course meant that stories would not last for longer than a single game. And it would do so just as MGS1 had used real-time 3D to challenge its era's norm of pre-rendered CG. The question, though, was how to do this, how to entertain both returning fans and first-time players. This question remains even today a serious one for the medium. But before we had modern game remakes or reboots, the Metal Gear series was already with MGS2 wrestling with similar quandaries, and the Tanker chapter is part of its solution. Originally, Tanker would have only started MGS2 if the player had saved data from clearing MGS1. Although this alternate start idea would not be realized at first, in New Game Plus and in subsequent releases of the game, players could choose to completely skip this chapter entirely. So technically, Sons of Liberty has not a single point of departure, like a linear story, it has two. In this, as software, the game reflects a realization that different people play the same game for different reasons. This actually complements many of MGS2's wider themes regarding notions of truth as mediated by subjective experience in the information age. This might explain why the game has two beginnings, two central characters, two stories. Tanker plays out like a love letter to fans of MGS1, yet the substance of this totally depends on the player's context. It matters to our experience whether we've played its predecessor or not. It matters in ways that hadn't yet in this medium. Yet having played MGS1 is not necessary for jumping with MGS2 and even the Tanker chapter right in. Metal Gear was in tandem with its underlying technology, by 2001 growing more open-ended, more multi-realized, more modular. The conceit has to be, again for us, that of Lego blocks. Blocks like the kind that MGS1 had been developed with. What MGS1 had used those blocks to do for combining story and presentation into what Kojima dubbed digital fusion, MGS2 was doing for the underlying player experience, for the very distinction between story and gameplay.
What's next? What is this? Snake, this isn't a game we're playing here. What's next? More of these? Is that all you think about? Hey, what you like is your business. Just get those Metal Gear pictures. I'll just make a backup of this one.
Different versions of the same underlying game could be experienced by multiple players simultaneously. MGS2 was my first Metal Gear game. Playing it at age 10, I lacked the proper context for Snake, Otacon, or Metal Gear my first time through. But like a TV series or YouTube video, the game provided enough to go on whether you were a steady viewer or completely new. Lacking the right context just made MGS2 more mysterious to me, more alluring.
Cipher. Excellent speech, my friend.
Who the?
Because you didn't need a ton of MGS experience to see that this was one of the most important releases of its age.
Right, and what are you looking at? Oh, I see. Rosemary,
What?
could you excuse him for a moment?
Huh?
You know, so he can...
Ah, I get it. Jack, let me know when you're done, okay?
Mm-hmm.
KCE Japan made great use of translucent effects and vertex processing in ways that had never been possible before, via aggressive use of the VU1, one of the PS2's idiosyncratic internal chips. The audio streaming technology for MGS2 was actually first developed for Police Knots, and also used in MGS1 and the Tokimeki Memorial series. Back in MGS1, the environment, though physically explorable freely, remained more or less one great big movie set. Yeah, you could look around it, and thanks to things like surveillance cameras, false walls, and invisible trip lasers, you could feel that you were interacting with it. An illusion of time and even climate gave us a sense of embodying a genuine time and space. But this was all, behind the surface, a carefully arranged contrivance, in a static sense that only seemed to be interactive. For example, the snow that you saw outside while looking around in first person in MGS1, it only seemed to be falling all across the map in real time. In truth, only the space directly in front of our face contains dynamic falling snow and whirling illusion eddies. It was a wonderful illusion, but an illusion this remained. Though arguably the first game ever to solidify the ideal of a playable movie in real-time interactive 3D, MGS1 was only the beginning. MGS2 would be this concept's true realization, christened, informally as it was, the Hollywood game. This Hollywood game concept, it explains everything about MGS2's construction and its design. Even the different starting points and player avatars were part of this, specifically part of MGS2's desire to reinvent the medium's standards for game sequels and make things more complementary with Hollywood movies. But this served as an ambitious, even pretentious act of radical reinvention. By styling itself as the Hollywood game, MGS2 was also challenging America's biggest cultural pastime, apart from maybe baseball, music, or nationalism: its silver screen. Games are now surpassing Hollywood movies as the century's turning from the 20th to 21st.
Americans are too in love with the sound of their own voice to speak the truth.
Identify yourself.
Yet games also remain hybrids of other media at this time too, media like music and novels. MGS2 subsequently would self-consciously not resemble a traditional movie structure, taking on at times the sort of strange twists and Byzantine plot turns and immediate subtlety, perhaps more signature of novels or even pop albums than a Hollywood big blockbuster sequel. As always then, MGS2 was a subversive outsider's project. It was a mission to change the industry on KCE Japan and Kojima's own terms. The biggest case in point here, apart from the game's rather iconoclastic storyline and scenario designs, had to be Metal Gear Solid 2's counterintuitive focus, yet again going contrary to the status quo. Sons of Liberty brought its contextual predecessors to bear into a completely new and revolutionary design environment. That was thanks to the PS2. I have to mention Kyle Cooper's iconic title sequence and the contribution of film scorer Harry Gregson Williams. Both were big-name talents from actual Hollywood movies. Their involvement went a long way towards legitimizing MGS2's cinematic pretensions. For the first time, perhaps, with Sons of Liberty, the series truly became high-tech, cutting-edge even. But more than high-tech, MGS2 was practically one big tech demo, showcasing the Sony PlayStation 2's capabilities. And it was here that the game truly meant something for both veterans of the series and rookies. We've already seen how crucial adventure games and lumbering old JPC platforms like the PC-98 or the MSX2 had been for Metal Gear's birth and growth. But until now, most of KCE Japan and Hideo Kojima's design ideas made do within limitations, whether those were limitations in terms of limited hardware or limited experience. Things somewhat changed in this regard for Metal Gear Solid 2. Building off the innovations and design foibles of MGS1, Sons of Liberty was built from the ground up as the ultimate case in point for what Sony's new space machine, the PS2, could do, for what games in the 21st century could be. Going back to at least Metal Gear 2 in 1990, the team had experimented with fusing in elements from the sim genre. This computer-centric form was a cousin of the sort of computer-assisted design and simulations that could be found at the time in commercial, academic, and even military settings. And as 3D transformed the worlds of war and work, only naturally so too did they transform the world's world of play. Before, whether in sim games or other types of genres, in video games dynamics were facsimiled, using, say, text or some graphical shorthand. Think back to the eggs that gradually hatched in Metal Gear 2 for this. We can also include here procedurally generated elements in sim games of the era, like Will Wright's SimCity. The player's city in that game seems to grow and change exponentially, and on an automated scale that reacts and reflects player choice, in a feedback-driven loop. Or we could take here Star Wars' TIE Fighter in 1994. Players in that game had to always be balancing mechanical concerns, sharing or diverting system power as needed. All these examples point to the single defining ideal of the era, apart from the phrase cinematic, the ideal called virtual reality. With the advent of 3D rendering and complex multi-process applications, now in games quite a lot could be happening under the hood, all at once. Demand for greater bandwidth and instant multiplicity led to the development of the PS2 in the first place, as a multimedia, multi-processing machine. This computer could crunch data and model lifelike dynamics in ways that, before now, were obtained only second-hand via crafty computer metaphor and player imagination. These new worlds that the PS2 made possible were no longer mere metaphors. More than ever, games were becoming stand-ins, or small slices, of what we could perceive anyway as real or hyper-real worlds. The revolution that Kojima's team, in other words, had been in their own small way working towards all along for roughly 14 years, was now apparently at hand. And this explained the importance for Metal Gear Solid 2 as an experiment in non-linearity. You'll remember the term that Kojima's crew devised for their new kind of adventure games back in the 90s had been the multi-process story. Sons of Liberty, with its dual openings and double protagonists, with its multiple entry and exit points in every area, and its open-ended, to some extent, gameplay scenarios, like bomb disposal, sneaking, prisoner escort, and so on. The game took this concept of the multi-process story and MGS1's unifying theory it had called digital fusion, all to new plateaus. All under the new banner of the Hollywood game. Suddenly, video games seemed capable of things that not even movies were. MGS2 married together blockbuster production values and high-concept art in ways not really seen in mainstream Hollywood since the 1970s. But to be more precise, MGS2 was weird only in a way that a game ever could be. It just found a way to package its difficult subject matter and misdirects in a popular form, and that's what made it comparable to such new Hollywood classics as Apocalypse Now, Blue Velvet, Alien, or The Terminator. Here was a landmark title for a new system in a new era where, by virtue of the DVD, games and movies were united on the same format for the first time. The times were becoming themselves largely dictated by the underlying basis for video games in the first place, the digital revolution. The PS2's powerful graphics led many early developers to fill PS2 games with more pre-rendered CG. And even when it wasn't pre-rendered, even though MGS1 had single-handedly brought the entire industry, worldwide, to shift more towards rendering 3D in real time, there still remained a question of polygonal priority. And in this, yet again, Kojima from the mainstream differed. The most immediate difference from the PS1 to the PS2 in this regard was, of course, character models, and that's what most early devs gravitated towards. The PS2 could now render highly detailed assets, and the best way to showcase that, apart from pre-rendered CG, I suppose, was prioritizing complex character faces and general designs. Sports, fighting, and RPG genre games were quick to dazzle the public with their vastly improved character renders and seemingly realistic graphics. But this telescoped the PS2's visual prowess, bottlenecking its workload behind the all-important way that things looked up close. If we look at early PS2 titles of this nature, like say Square Enix's The Bouncer, or even say Capcom's Onimusha Warlords, we find that though the character models up close look pretty good, environments only seem marginally better looking than they were on the late PS1. And still, like PS1 titles, like MGS2 in fact, environments in these games are relatively uninteresting and uninvolved with the gameplay. A mere Hollywood set and not much else. Simply put, the environments of these early PS2 games lacked the most important thing you need for virtual realities. A genuine feeling, a sense of true immersion and escape. A sense of substance. MGS2 was to be that substance, that great escape into substance, that ultimate submergence into a digital realm. Heavily influenced by the original Matrix film, MGS2 sought to bring players a comprehensive pseudo-world. One constructed in LEGO fashion that could also be played along various different routes and in different styles, and one that would remain for any player both seamless and seeming pseudo-real. Chief among this revolution's virtues was the shift away that MGS2 represented from high-poly character models up close, and towards overall harmony and dynamically driven feedback with the player's environment, our entire little world, wherein our player character and other NPCs are just actors. Kojima's 99 draft of MGS2's grand design document explains the focus on environments in terms of practicality. Knowing KCE Japan could never compete with the pre-rendered or high-poly facial animations of rivals like Square, Kojima deliberately drew the team's focus, as he did in MGS1, onto atmosphere and overall look and feel. This included obvious things like the inclusion of new features into the game mechanically, features that were only now possible on the PS2, like first-person shooting, shadows, context-sensitive injuries, and giving every single NPC a name via dog tags. This also included under-the-hood stuff that MGS2 contributed to the medium, stuff like extremely complex enemy AI or extremely detailed interactive environments. The Untitled Chapter, then, was more in this regard than a love letter for fans that would continue the story more akin to a Hollywood sequel. The tanker also represented a vertical slice. We saw a vertical slice in MGS1's opening stage, the Cavern. A vertical slice is an industry term that puts every major thing a game is setting out to do in miniature form, like a diorama, encapsulating the entire experience the game sets out to provide, all in a single bite-sized scenario. The Cavern docks in MGS1 accomplished this in numerous ways. It introduced everything from multiple sneaking routes to knocking, wet footprints, noise, alerts, the camera system, the codec, first-person view, the O2 gauge while underwater, and more. Even how the opening credits played out atop the gameplay seamlessly spoke to the opening's power as a vertical slice, as an illustration of the game's concept of digital fusion, of marrying together story and gameplay, movie and video game. It's almost like a demo or summary at the start of a paper. A vertical slice is like a promise, defining a game's aims, setting us up for what to expect. The tanker expanded the size of the vertical slice from one big opening stage like in MGS1 to an entire self-contained mini episode. This was already a major revolution in of itself by suggesting that the days of discrete piecemeal scenario planning that Kojima had come up on were at an end. Rather than this old-fashioned game planning model, MGS2 integrated its scenarios seamlessly, as evident in the tanker, to become something greater than the mere sum of their parts. But what do I mean? Well, the central conceit of Tanker plays out over its entire duration, not starting and stopping like scenarios in MGS1 did when you moved from one stage or area to the next, but playing out as a whole. The whole notion of stages, inherited as they were from the arcade, MGS2 dispensed with. The scenarios of Tanker flow together seamlessly, one into the next, not so much horizontally in a linear line, but vertically, stacked on top of each other. Together, no differently than the structure, perhaps, of the Tanker setting itself. From Metal Gear 87 to MGS1, these games had played out in grids. A hallmark of the MSX2. With MGS1, this 2D grid became cubic, forming a solid shape, forming something like 3D. But MGS2 added to this equation a height, presence, and scale more suited for something approaching reality. Now, the physical environment had physical properties of its own. Ascending the Tanker may have resembled climbing the towers of Outer Heaven, Zanzibar, or Shadow Moses, but the feeling differed. And the feeling, was what mattered most. Climbing or descending the ship's superstructure broke us out of the blocky mold that we had gotten used to in prior games, branching as it does and continuing seamlessly, it seems, in all directions. MGS1 had been full of environmental storytelling and immersive subtle details of its own, like the abandoned computers and research stations we could find inside the Warhead storage building, or the toilet paper evident in the cells of the tank hangar. MGS2 took this conceit to unbelievable new heights. The Tanker, for example, was full of traces of life, and from pots to glasses, from ketchup bottles to fire extinguishers and flour bags, this lifelike world was truly interactive. Crucially, this went much further than any film or film set ever could. As just one example, each one of these pots, when struck, will play a different musical note. That is something like a sim game, something that the industry, barring perhaps Yu Suzuki with Shenmue, had yet to see. Prioritizing the entire construction whole cloth rather than just up-close character visuals alone more suited also the PS2's design. Here was a machine tailor-made for dynamic processing, for lots of data and applications at once. Sacrificing a little on the character models up close simply repeated MGS1's trick of prioritizing 3D rendering in real time. Both necessitated drawing a focus away from character models themselves and towards their place within a wider immersive scene or environment, or pseudo-reality. It was in both cases a gamble, and in both cases this gamble paid off. Just as MGS1 changed the medium by popularizing cinematic real-time 3D, MGS2 would do for environmental complexity and design.
Right, and I didn't know you had such weird interests. Not that there's anything wrong with that, though. Just that, well, it's a little weird.
Jack, I think that's a little weird.
The PS2 is truly specialized for gaming because how it moves around data and functions collectively is so unique. The system's custom vector processing units make it possible to go beyond the construction of mere movie sets into whole-cloth worlds, geometrically expressed procedurally via algorithms and so-called floating point calculations. What's more, the entire graphical data pipeline is programmable, offering at least two constellations, parallel and serial. That means the programmers have to decide their own game's optimal setup. This ensures no two PS2 games will be designed exactly alike. It's thanks to the PS2 vector processing units that MGS2 will lead a revolution in environmental emphasis. VPU0 and VPU1, which actually work a little differently from each other, crunch geometry and trigonometry equations for the GPU, the graphics synthesizer. This, in tandem with texture processing known as MIP mapping and other console-specific features, allows MGS2 its iconic and all-pervading sense of the uncanny, of realer than real, what French thinker and patron saint of postmodernism Jean Baudrillard had formerly dubbed the hyperreal. One can't watch ice melt or see the connecting bridge to Shell 2 destroyed without forgetting for a second it's all a digital illusion. But that's the power of movies and movie making MGS2 reinvents for the video game age, a kind of total suspension of disbelief. It's the era fact has become, by virtue of all the magic of the digital revolution, rather hard to disentangle from the snake-like tendrils of fiction. MGS2's game design was its philosophy. Its story and themes were its gameplay scenarios, and part of its internal composition. With MGS2, all the old Kojima concepts like the multi-process story and digital fusion reached their apex. Kojima's lifelong themes like knowing better than to always trust your own version of perceived reality found new and ultimate expressions via the PS2. The sense of adventure and smoky noir mystery, of action and suspense commingling with heart and terror, MGS2 was quintessentially a Kojima game. But the PS2's technology, combined with KCE Japan's shared sense of commitment to push video games forward. You get a sense everyone involved genuinely wanted to see the medium gain acceptance in their own lifetimes. The team, not only Kojima but the entire staff of KCE Japan, as they typically always did, gave their all. The result was truly a testament to the power not only of the PS2 but more importantly, of human will. The game would be a love letter to both the future and the past, while representing a true revolution for the present. In prior Kojima games, their adventure game foundations often gave Kojima and the developers most of the control. Further, games had not yet reached, prior to the 21st century, the technical complexity to go totally beyond this essentially linear old media pastime of the story and themes and general ideas getting transmitted to the player as if we were merely the audience member, the listener or reader. MGS2 is something different. What it wants to say does not rely singularly anymore on what programmers might dub explicit data, on static, pre-devised sequences in which the player takes little part. Every second of playtime, you are part of MGS2's general conceits. You are being shown MGS2, not told. And really, more than being shown, you're playing. Show don't tell is an old Hollywood movie-making rule of thumb. It's also one shared to some extent by novels or even philosophy. It's the idea that the best way to convey a thing or idea is to illustrate it by example or metaphor, by including your audience. Given how well MGS2's deceptive and seductively pseudo-real interactive world coincides with its non-interactive, director-driven themes, as I've been saying all along, story and gameplay, MGS2 finally fused together. And fused for good. But another crucial advance has to do with importing a certain sense of culture and history. MGS1 had done well capturing the tenor of its times, with the story setting and themes all reflective of the end of the Cold War. But MGS2 made things positively Kubrickian in their unimaginable scale. This was a game not just about the American century or comparing the rise of the information age to the reign of American movies. MGS2 was about all human events, all history, all human life, like Kubrick's 2001 or A Clockwork Orange to some extent. This almost anthropological dimension doubled as a subtle critique of Hollywood, computers, and the English language, given how their predominance has necessarily also meant the withering away of alternative modalities of meaning. It's something vaguely hinted at by MGS2's stunning opening title sequence, which seems at first to follow humanity's footsteps out of the primeval oceans, to the invention of writing, to the formalization of law, and the birth of democratic nationalism. When Kojima said MGS2 would be a kind of submergence, he wasn't lying. This was no typical game, this was a revolution, full stop. A revolution in storytelling and in video game design. Each Kojima game had the feeling of you being controlled from the shadows. MGS2 became a full-blown psych experiment. Our true stand-in Raiden starts for everyone the same but becomes over time different. The payoff for this takes seeing Sons of Liberty through to the end, where you're encouraged to find your own name, your own raison d'etre. Such was, in the new century, the new requirement. Not many realized that Sons of Liberty also spelled the acronym shit out of luck. Just as the Patriots are SOL in this new era that they can no longer safely control, just as Raiden is SOL in how he can no longer afford to run from everything about himself and the world he dislikes, the player is SOL too. The game, betraying us, defies its given cultural role as mere entertainment by admitting that it is in fact only a game. Not even the Patriots are definitely real by the end. Yet ironically, this is exactly how MGS2 elevates itself as more than a game. Here was no mere time burner or mindless distraction. MGS2 was an experience, a self-aware one whose privately arrived at meanings the player could take with us for the rest of our lives. And that is truly what MGS2 gave to the medium and to the world. Even if faces in MGS2 were less detailed than rival games, one element the team could now implement was sophisticated facial renders, which they used to comment on or coincide with other MGS characters and games. The biggest example here had to be the game's antagonist, Solidus Snake. His face was actually an aged-up version of Snake's. Another was Pliskin, the cover identity of the real Snake on board the Big Shell. Now you could provide him with an electric shaver, which would result by the end in a freshly shaven Snake. Revolver Ocelot was brought back to life faithfully from his appearance in MGS1, albeit with an arm graft, something that would have been impossible to portray on the PS1. Characters like Olga and Rose were designed to evoke MGS1 characters like Meryl and Naomi. The sequel concept was marrying with the PS2's technology in interesting ways. More than MGS1, Sons of Liberty was like a movie production. Extensive storyboarding and motion capturing were involved, not to mention the creation of stage prop models. But the wide majority of motion and facial animations in the game were done not by mocap but by hand, a new entire field to the medium. That being said, the team did study medical reference materials to get down, quote, shoulder motions and muscles for facial expressions, end quote. All these visual aspects to MGS2 were achieved thanks only to research into the PS2's hardware Konami had funded early on. Metal Gear Solid 2 took the medium seriously, maybe unlike any game before it. This era where war was starting to resemble peace, where war was being deprived of its substance, becoming something decaffeinated, something surface level that looked like security. This era was sometimes called the US's unipolar or hyperpower moment. It would of course all begin to come tragically crashing down one blue day in the fall of 2001, in terror attacks that forced last-minute changes and delays for MGS2, to say nothing of their Leviathan-sized impact on virtually everything else in the world. However, even though the unipolar moment of America, sometimes then not ironically prior to 9/11 christened the end of history, was by MGS2's debut already suddenly drawing to an end, the game would still become more relevant in time, more relevant than it could ever know. Substance deprived of original context. A tale whose meaning not only grows, but comes into being solely by virtue of the telling. MGS2, in the perfect irony, became the living embodiment of its own deepest and most oceanic themes. The world will be drowned in the coming flood, MGS2 prophesizes, the flood of digital information. The game marked the century's turn by Y2K-era brand appeals to New Age mysticism by way of sacred dead texts and pantomimed, simulated traditions. Like the Mayan clock or Book of Revelations myths proliferating in MGS2's era, the one that surrounded the Tower of Babel-like crisis known as the Y2K bug scare, MGS2 portrayed the future through the prism of the past, as almost preordained, foretold, and pre-written in texts, in biblical terms, in Old Testaments. While the player carries out our own simulated reprisal of the prior title's plot and character dynamics, the plot in MGS2 is itself a story simulating strains of older stories, a text that's become, in a meta kind of way, almost self-aware. Perhaps like how Otacon in the Tanker chapter can become mechanically self-aware of the content and context of Snake's photos that you've snapped at will. Subsequently, things like self-awareness, consciousness, trauma, and memory all become crucial to MGS2. It may have been the first truly psychologically expressionistic video game.
Actually, we're also inside the memory of Shadow Moses.
But isn't something like this what Kojima had been striving towards his entire career? A game that's self-aware, that integrates indeterminate processes emerging from player choice with predetermined storylines, character arcs, and deeper thematic motifs. That had always been Kojima and his team's true defining dream, their version of the true playable movie, true pop cultural, commercial virtual reality. Simply put, what truly made MGS2 important was not only its medium-redefining emphasis on environments or sim elements, it mattered also for once and for all declaring story and game to be a single unified independence. Story and game work together in MGS2 seamlessly, in union, no differently perhaps than the inner workings of the game's platform, the PS2. Though incredibly dense and complex with story, and revolutionary in its unprecedented caliber of video game storytelling, story in Sons of Liberty still merely serves, as it always has in Kojima's games, to service the gameplay.
You're Ames, aren't you?
Use the microphone to listen in.
King, Fat Man is dead.
It doesn't matter.
The two registers become more than ever indivisible, something Kojima has been honing ever since the original MSX2 game Metal Gear. All the narrative content merely works off of the essential component that ties everything together. Not story or gameplay, but what's underneath both. The feel. The feeling the players experience. Whether playing a gameplay scenario or watching a cutscene, the player experiences MGS2 as an unbroken, seamless continuity. This is what allows a kind of black box reverse engineering by KCE Japan, so that the prior title's design conceit of digital fusion by way of the PS2's prowess becomes fully realized and thereby transformed. But here, I'll perhaps need to be more specific. The Tanker Prologue, it's very carefully designed to be two things at once. A new environment and mechanical framework, yet also one totally true to the feeling of the previous game. Kojima's been fascinated with questions of history repeating, of nostalgia and fate ever since the days of SD Snatcher and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. This long-lasting theme uses the trappings of the Hollywood sequel in MGS2 to achieve unprecedented realization, by way of things like the Tanker chapter. Think back to Gustava's trip in the Zanzibarland sewers and how it resembled a reprisal of her Polish mother's stories of how she had to escape the Nazis. Think of how the first time MGS1 introduced us to Ninja, secretly a reintroduction of a character we already know named Grey Fox. It did so by beginning where our last memories with Fox ended, in a minefield. Also think of how MGS1's layout and scenarios resembled Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. This had both narrative as well as gameplay reasons. It not only essentially rebooted Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake for a new audience, age, and platform, it used gameplay to provide players directly a sense of Snake's sense of déjà vu. All of this with the Tanker and its close similarity to the entire events of MGS1, MGS2, as the Hollywood game or true blue video game sequel, would expand dramatically, even exponentially. Things repeat themselves, yet a kind of meaning drift occurs, organically, over time. The past is not merely repeated in these games, it's reinterpreted. Parts and even truths of the past, like every human construction, are, over enough time, bound to decay. MGS2 conveyed these themes in a manner only games could achieve, and in a way that the medium is still struggling to totally comprehend today. Why? because MGS2, unlike perhaps anything that's possible from other mediums, used the very concepts of storytelling and themes in video game-specific ways. The result was something that involves the audience, or more correctly speaking, the player. Games as interactive software are active. They're not the final piece. Games are merely the Lego blocks, the toy set, out of which only by player-generated acts does the final form and shape of a game become solid. This has been true to some degree of every single Hideo Kojima game. They've always used interactivity to provide not something all just about Kojima or his capital I ideas, but something for the player's final say over, something we don't just observe, we participate in, we co-author. MGS1 achieved this by, for example, waiting to reveal the Genome Army are our biological brethren, or that really we've been nothing more than a plague-poisoned rat let loose in our enemy's camp. These story twists would scarcely pack as much power if they did not so directly play off decisions that we players freely willed. This helps challenge our notions of free will versus fate, thematically speaking, presenting complex questions from philosophy and science in incredibly direct ways. Yet it does so without erasing our role as players who are playing Kojima and KCE Japan's game. All of this was only preamble for Sons of Liberty. The game, using one of the most notorious bait and switches in video game history, made deception and subversion cornerstones of quality games writing in the 21st century. But notice this is yet another example of how extremely this one man and design team merged together the entire industry's ideas of story and gameplay at the turn of the century. I'm talking, of course, about Raiden. Though the first 90% of the Tinker Chapter follows the unconscious rhythm of MGS1 exactly, in its final moments the game takes a seriously unsettling turn. The player is drowned, first figuratively by a deluge of names and events that we don't understand, and then literally drowned as Snake seems to drown in the New York Bay. Then the system that is MGS2 effectively reboots, this time with a sparkling white, almost featureless, genderless new stand-in for Snake, the albino-esque green foxhounder, Raiden. The tension this creates between the MGS in our memories and the MGS we're playing now, between the role of Snake that we know we are meant to play and the reality of the non-Snake that we know we are, is exquisite, as new players can only gulp the air and sputter confused obscenities at every fresh and bewildering hell. Raiden is like a sketch of a person that the player, by playing Raiden's role, feels as if we are virtually and vicariously filling in. The multi-process story framework that we've covered in prior entries, with MGS2 entered a higher form. You might say our new player character, Raiden, is styled like a PC. Out of the box, everyone's Raiden is the same. It's only with use over time that certain personalized features can emerge. For example, Raiden can be a pervert, which the game will relish in returning to on multiple occasions.
Do you know what that place is?
I just thought maybe the bomb disposal instructor might be in there.
Why would he be in there?
Well, you never know. He's AWOL and...
Even AWOL, a normal guy wouldn't go into a woman's bathroom. You're the only one I know who would. You're like really strange.
But one of my favorite examples is what happens if, after going through some of the game without killing anyone, Raiden takes his first life. The conversation that follows with Rose is truly excellent, yet it's an example of something in MGS2 that many players failed to see.
Rose? No comment?
About?
I've killed someone.
Jack, it's a battlefield.
My opponents are living, breathing human beings. This isn't like the VR training. They have bodies. They have had lives. I took all that away from them.
But you've got no choice if you want to survive.
And yet, maybe because of the VR training, I can't help but try and block out that reality. It's the only way I can manage to fight.
Jack.
What?
I don't care what it takes, just as long as you come back alive. Do whatever it takes, please. Just come back in one piece.
Okay.
In the PS2 age, the multi-process story was expanding to better fit both the technology and MGS as a saga of espionage conspiracy thrillers. MGS2, a game after all about information, is fittingly full of secrets and missable codec calls, all of which drive up its replay value considerably.
Tell me what you know about Fat Man.
Okay, hold on a minute. I'll look him up.
And new rewards unlocked for completing the game with certain added challenges, like minimal kills or alerts or rations used or continues, it all drove that replay value even further. The Gordian knot-like plot also demanded multiple playthroughs to grasp, and even then, MGS2 knew better than to answer every one of its mysteries. And on this, it may have done a little too well. Soon enough, rabid fans obsessed with answers regarding the Patriots and more would soon be sending Kojima death threats. When word came down that MGS2 was going to supposedly be his last Metal Gear. Try as he might, Kojima would be unable to shake his signature series, not for another 14 years. The legend, it seems, is no match for reality. Sometimes ideas, legends, and words can take on a life of their own. The persona of Hideo Kojima and the legacy of his famous franchise Metal Gear would come to overshadow the real man and the real games, trapping both creator and creation in their own double helixes of lies, rumors, myth, and misinterpretation. Like always, Kojima's art would resemble his reality, as these themes, beginning with MGS2, would become more and more central to Metal Gear. But again, Sons of Liberty was trying to be something more than just a movie. It was a movie you could play. And to this end, the game introduced a new basic thing to the gameplay loop: accessing each strut's node. The big shell, you see, was connected together via a closed network, exactly like the game's own production team, KCE Japan. These nodes were the stars along that network's constellation. Back in MGS1, the room housing Otacon and Grey Fox had actually secretly been modeled on the team's very own office space. More and more, it seems, elements from the production side of things were finding their way into the games. A case in point for how MGS2 changed the industry, in terms at least of environmental design, has to be how the big shell, whenever you're outside, is always visible, even if imperfectly so, as one giant superstructure. Again, no mere movie set. This was interactive. Soon enough, a similar conceit would dominate as part of the genre of open-world games. Years after MGS2, many other games in its wake would utilize settings with fully explorable environments, similar to the big shell, even if there are admittedly parts of it we never explore. But more than just its environments, MGS2 was a major pioneer in what we might call atmosphere. Watch a moment of this scene, for example, with Olga and Raiden. Notice how the sunlight stings the camera lens. The wind can be heard savagely tearing across the backdrop.
Olga, are you sure it wasn't an Arsenal Tengu?
Don't be a fool. Think I wouldn't know the difference?
This was a kind of scene direction and attention to detail that had never been seen, not even on PCs. For just a little while, console games became the dominant format for the medium at large, and it arguably all went back to the PS2 and console seller killer apps like Sons of Liberty. The game greatly expanded the fast travel system found in its predecessor, with many of the big shell struts having their own special box and delivery point, and a central terminal where all the different conveyor belts converged. This served as a kind of hub, giving the game even a pseudo-dynamic impression of logistics. And this we could also see in the various pipelines extending the length of the big shell's perimeter, which we were invited to imagine really did collectively function as an offshore oil treatment plant. Further subtle modalities were imported onto pre-existing mechanics. Take bleeding, for example, or having to now hide bodies in lockers. The inclusion of tranquilizer darts opened the way for non-lethal playthroughs and a whole host of new design applications to boot. But the biggest area MGS2 advanced over MGS1 and moved the medium forward, in terms at least of technical composition, would have to be the advanced and well-coordinated enemy AI. MGS1's multiple difficulty settings had been added last minute just to the Western version. With MGS2, KCE Japan had designed the game with multiple replays and different difficulty settings in mind from the start. The experience thereby became quite different from one level of challenge to the next. As I may have already mentioned, every single enemy in the game has a dog tag, has their own name, and if you wanted to collect all of them, you'd have to complete the game on the hardest difficulty. What really seemed impressive was that on most difficulties, the game would remember events that had took place in gameplay on previous struts. Bodies that you had left would still be there, cameras would still be shot out, and so on. And now the enemy could track your blood trail and figure out you were hiding an event. They could surround your position and use SWAT tactics to force you out in the open like a wild animal. And the enemy kept in constant communication, seeming to work together as some kind of hive mind. Taking a guard out now carried the cost of momentarily, potentially, raising the overall level of vigilance should your actions be found out.
Communications with the heliport on the roof of Struddy have ceased. Carry out an investigation immediately.
And first-person targeting meant you always now tried to hit the enemy's radio on their back, just to be safe. But some sentries would be noticed if they went dark for too long. All this new strategic depth took the basics of MGS1 and created with them a truly addictive, mind-blowingly immersive masterpiece, via synthesizing practical yet innovative design ideas with the novel design environment of the PS2. The analog stick or D-pad could again both be used, but this time around they couldn't have felt more different to actually use. The analog stick in MGS2 is especially fluid for the era, giving Raiden in particular a real serpentine flow to his movements. And traces of some of the early ideas for the game still lived on, not only in modified form as the two different game settings, but also in the numerous self-contained time limit scenarios that MGS2 throws at you. You'll remember the original premise was Snake having to complete his mission in time for a nuclear inspection. A time limit would tick down in real time throughout the entire game. But where things truly got insane in the final product was during Sons of Liberty's truly epic boss fights, a cut above even MGS1. Take one as a random example, the fake boss fight with Fortune. This scenario could just by itself yet again serve as some kind of tech demo for the entire console. Amazingly, the oil that you see slowly seeping out of the barrels at the start seems to be flammable, triggering huge explosions once it eventually in the scene meets fire. The destructible set, independently moving objects that demonstrate MGS2's advanced physics engine, and gradual fire that starts to spread and consume the entire map. Stuff like this is everywhere in MGS2, even if it's almost always pre-packaged in a carefully prefigured form, just like this. Metal Gear Solid 2 showed off not only what the PlayStation 2 could do, but what video games could and would become in the 21st century. As I've tried to demonstrate this entire video, Sons of Liberty might have been the first video game of the 21st century. This is part of what I meant by saying MGS2 married story and gameplay together indistinguishably, perhaps for the first time. MGS2 would start years of endless fan analysis and overinterpretation, but it's easy to forget how crucially the game's form depended on it being a video game. As much as its storyline dripped with thematic and loric resonance, we can't overlook what it set out to both be and do as a game. MGS2's central chapter, Plant, has a structure or layout that reduces the logic perhaps of all video games to that point down into skeletal form. Each stage, as it were, freely floats in space, connected together in a circuitous schematic resembling the neural network paradigm in AI, or even perhaps the internal architecture of the PS2. These stages are oriented according to MGS2's structure of narrative, which places at their centers of both literal internal structures comprising the big shell, shells 1 and 2, cores. These cores happen to be where the more momentous story scenarios play out, justifying diegetically why they also happen to be the best guarded and hardest to access. I'll explain the concept of diegesis in a second. Then, of course, there is the secret final 2 locations, deep within the secret amphibious swimming fortress Arsenal Gear, and lastly, on land, in a real-world location, Lower Manhattan. By running fiction aground against reality in this way, the magic circle's widening by MGS2 is thereby complete. The inclusion of a facsimile of New York City drove the game's closing sentiments home. Nowadays, anything can be simulated or quantified. We have an obligation, MGS2 compels us to see, both to admit that we cling to false meanings in this era of ready-made digital truths, and to admit, in spite of it all, we still have things to really believe in. This new century, new technology, MGS2 presented as both a challenge and opportunity. We could allow ourselves to be consumed by our illusions, the game suggests, or we could use their power to remember who we really are and pass pieces of our truths on to future generations. This also helped explain the game's shadowy Illuminati-like cabal, the Patriots. Fans would get so excited by the potential political implications of the Patriots that they'd all too often overlook yet again that the role the Patriots play as the antagonists in a game. Hideo Kojima has mentioned that the SF for science fiction for him also entails speculative fiction too. The point is not, in other words, that a cabal like the Patriots really exists, but that it could, and that we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The Patriots are the mother of all conspiracies personified, the speculated source of every political, military, or socio-economic incident. Like the Oni myth for the ancient Japanese, perhaps, the Patriots are merely the personification of certain anxieties and pains. They symbolize everything about the modern age that we simply have to take on faith, all the secret insecurities, fears, and paranoia that life today can't help but breed. In this, MGS2 was no different than The Matrix. However, one thing unique to Sons of Liberty was its status as a Japanese game for a global, predominantly English-speaking marketplace. Some of its more Japanese elements, like Raiden's appearance, for example, were lost on many in the West. But the game provided a truly singular Eastern-Western fusion, both of design as well as style. The samurai swords and white doves of the final fight were signatures of, say, John Woo or anime. Yet the many Titanic references and Tom Clancy-esque overall premise were examples of how the game skewed Western. It may have been because of this particular saddling across 2 worlds, MGS2 also enjoyed playing many language games, games that were sure to bewilder all. Kojima chose names to sound strange in every language, going back at least to MGS1, but with its sequel and its themes and content surrounding artificial intelligence, playing with names and patterns of language, forging whole networks of meaning, it all became crucial. Many characters in Metal Gear Solid 2 have names whose acronyms match those of key PS2 components. EE for Emma Emmerich, as in Emotion Engine, GS for George Sears, as in the graphics synthesizer, PS for Peter Stillman, as in PlayStation, and so on. Designed to be, in Kojima's words, the first postmodern video game of the 21st century, MGS2 made networks, quite literally, connecting back to both older Kojima games, but also some of his favorite books, movies, comics, and TV shows. The entire plot simulates not only the events of the prior title, but the American Revolution. Snatches, strands, and fragments of dialogue or text taken from older Kojima titles re-emerged in MGS2 in subtle, often cryptic or unexpected ways. The sense all of this was meant to conjure for the player was one of freely floating in the ether of information, all substance cut from its original context, yet, though deprived of meaning, never fading, always accessible, always in a process of reinterpretation. This has been dubbed the postmodern condition. MGS2 captured it, both in terms of story and gameplay, flawlessly. But the best case in point for how this all occurred by MGS2 fusing together interaction and narrativity is the Patriot's secret plan, the S3 plan, at the heart of the game. The S3 plan is what truly makes MGS2, even today, matter. The S3 plan, simply put, is Metal Gear Solid 2 itself. It's how the diegetic loop is closed, MGS2's magic circle made complete. If something's diegetic, It means it's happening both inside a fictional world and at the same time outside, in our world's depiction of it. The S3 plan brought reality and fiction into contact in a revolutionary way. All along while playing as Snake or Raiden, the players unwittingly also been playing the Patriots' little game. The S3 plan refers to the protocol that they intend to use to shape people's perceptions of reality. And we are the S3 plan's first test subject. It's behind everything in the game. Everything, which all, by the way, happens to be lies. The S3 plan is the psych experiment that gets us from Snake at the start of Tanker to Raiden by the end of Plant. Each of MGS2's scenarios and sudden changes, from jumping protagonists to killing off the president and disposing bombs and much more, each was a test to see whether we, both we the player but also we the player character, would play along. And play along we did. The emotions, the memories, the meaning of everything that we experienced along the way, even knowing by the end it was all merely the byproducts of fake worlds and fake scenarios, we still can't help feeling something about them. MGS2 completely reinvented the concept of show, don't tell, demonstrating its central themes and ideas firsthand, interactively, via gameplay. A gameplay which, again, could not be distinguished from story or themes. And of course, the entire point was how perfectly this S3 premise overlaps with the real-world experience of playing any video game. We know none of it is real, yet it still really means something to us by the end. That's exactly the side to ourselves MGS2 was built to, in part, expose, yet at the same time, in part, celebrate. And it all, as masterfully done as it is, could only ever work as a video game.
Oh, I'm going to go in my pants. Nobody's looking, right? Right, my sympathies. Sneaking missions are called wet works for a reason after all.
The enemy was incredibly more responsive in Sons of Liberty. Now guards could wake up a comrade, use binoculars to find you,
It's the enemy! I need help!
bleed out when fatally wounded, hold back from shooting once you've grabbed a hostage, and resist a holdup or duck a grab. An advanced collision detection system governed each individual bullet's trajectory, and the game kept track at all times of exactly how many bullets you'd fired across your entire save. For all its mechanical depth and scenario diversity, Plant is, under the hood, very carefully paced. MGS2 starts Raiden slowly, only introducing him at first to a handful of enemies. That is, unless you're brave enough to venture into Strut F, the Big Shell's armory. If so, you'll be rewarded with the Trank Pistol, the modified M9, early, but that's only if you manage to sneak past the new unmanned enemies like the Cypher drone and utilize MGS2's newest dimension, its verticality, by either hanging or using platforms. I could go on, but I doubt a comprehensive breakdown of how MGS2's gameplay doles itself out is really, for now at least, warranted. Put broadly, the game is very evenly paced, moving from what are essentially still good old-fashioned game planner scenarios one by one, expressed in an unusually open-ended way. Thanks, of course, to the PS2. MGS2 may have still secretly contained a bedrock of conventional video game design, but those elements would blend more and more into the background as this series would go on. And even by Sons of Liberty, general resemblance to 20th century eras of the medium was already growing faint. One of, if not the, single most important character dynamics in Sons of Liberty is the one between Jack and Rose.
Well...
Don't you think it's selfish to expect everyone to be at your beck and call? I'm not your personal possession, you know.
That's not how I think of you.
Is that so?
Their Hollywood romance is gradually exposed as yet another big shell.
You're a spy?
I suppose. Yes. It's an ugly word.
Raiden, like James from Silent Hill 2, is a hardcore narcissist. MGS2 would talk about relationships and human psychology in ways unfamiliar to the Hollywood tradition and completely alien to video games.
I didn't teach him the most important thing I had to tell him. There are some things you have to pass on. The trick is to know which one.
Rose, secretly held hostage by your overlords to make sure you finish your mission, and who only entered your orbit in the first place as part of their ruse, actually wants Jack to catch her, wants, for that matter, for him to discover the true her along the way. But Jack prefers her as an object, a stage prop, totally unaware of the living, breathing woman that she contains. Their relationship develops and evolves throughout the game organically, giving up little morsels every time the player saves. Rosemary's betrayal, if we can even call it that, conjures the memory of MGS1's Naomi, yet her character and arc are far more nuanced and complex than anything possible on the PS1. Her deceptions, thereby, in the end, only make sense within MGS2's context as the Hollywood game.
Exactly right. So you see, you're a perfect representative of the masses we need to protect. This is why we chose you. You accepted the fiction we've provided, obeyed our orders, and did everything you were told to. The exercise is a resounding success.
Weaving together hard science fiction, spine-tingling Illuminati-like intrigue, Tom Clancy-esque spy and military action, as well as magical realism, MGS2 had even more tricks to pull by the end. By the end, the game becomes a disarmingly gripping and eloquent tragedy, tackling unbelievably taboo subject matter, from terrorism to incest to child soldiers and the illiberalism of modern liberal democracy under the age of the Pax Americana. From the Patriot Militias movement to the Lewinsky affair, Iraq, the Balkans, Wall Street, Hollywood, and the rise of AI, all signature concerns of the 1990s, MGS2 was a jaw-droppingly subversive game that played on the era while truly solidifying Kojima's place as an icon, one mired in misinterpretation, obsession, and controversy. Many in the West, however, hated the game's weaving, layered storyline, and particularly hated the characters Raiden and his girlfriend Rose. Some even argued the game's story made no sense whatsoever, was just too ridiculous and pretentious, or just overwhelmed the gameplay. It was to these critics that Kojima addressed with the subject of our next episode, 2004's Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. From its bizarrely idiosyncratic story and characters to its well-oiled sneaking and boss fight scenarios, MGS2 was, maybe even more than its predecessor, truly one for the history books. Its themes of information overload, the self-destructive logic and nature of truth as imagined by the digital age, its ultimate message of leaving the project of finding out life's meaning to the player ourselves. Everything about MGS2 in terms of story, as brilliant as it is, cannot be separated completely from how those narrative elements are relayed. Namely, via interactivity, via playing the game. For these reasons, MGS2 may be called the century's first true exemplary video game. Its influence, like pools of water after heavy rain, remains evident in pockets and down wells all across the medium.